Hi everyone! Today I want to share with you the books I've read so far in February. This is, I suppose, a part one of a February wrap-up. I'm not organized enough to be consistent in how I do my wrap-ups. Sometimes it's random, sometimes it's monthly. I apologize. I don't actually know what I'm doing, so if you thought I did, I'm sorry. Anyway, I only have 4 books to talk about today, so let's just jump straight into it. The first one we're going to start with is The Story of an African Farm by Olive Schreiner. I had no expectations for this book and ended up really enjoying this. This is a classic. It was published in 1883 and takes place in South Africa, and it is a colonial story of South Africa, so all the characters are white. We mostly follow Em and Lyndall and Waldo, and it begins with their experience of their adolescence, and then there's a kind of jarring jump cut into their early adulthood years. And the story of sort of what happens to these characters is not as interesting as a lot of the ideas and philosophies that the author is really playing with. Waldo is a very pensive character, and we get a lot of thoughts of his that really lead to conversations of very critical religiosity. He begins a very religious character and becomes more and more disenchanted and distant from his faith. Lyndall is a very progressive female character. We would today call her a feminist, but that's not a thing that existed in the 1880s. Instead, she would be more accurately called a proto-New Woman character. There was some early suffragette movement happening in the 1880s, but Lyndall as a character and a lot of her dialogue inside of this book actually was very inspirational and a contribution to a lot of conversation that was really solidifying at that time concerning criticism towards the social conventions of gender roles for women in Victorian society. And Lyndall is very articulate and very forceful in her criticism of how limiting this can be for a lot of women. And both Em and Lyndall's experiences in this book are very much dictated by Victorian social conventions for women, their gender expectations. Both of these women are orphaned and have are stuck in sort of a position of needing men for a variety of ways, and they each react to that differently. There are several ways that this book is actually really interesting, the way that it plays with gender and gender performance. There's a cross-dressing character at one time, and an argument for a lot of androgyny in several of the characters, so this book is just really ahead of its time in that regard. This book also is really experimental in form in ways that I'm a sucker for, and I did find interesting, though I didn't find always effective, but it's very, very interesting considering the time period that this book was written in, which actually really the final thing that I thought was interesting about this book is that it is a Victorian novel. It is, as I said, written in 1883, and the Victorian era lasts until 1801. And this book is in some ways obviously a product of the Victorian era, including some of the like coming of age themes for these characters that could be compared to like David Copperfield, for example. But it's also, the novel in its content and its form is extremely forward-thinking and really foreshadowing some of the broader modernist movements that we see after the turn of the century. And as someone who has never really read that transition point before, I've become increasingly familiar with defining the characteristics of Victorian literature and then of modernist literature, but understanding that transition, which is really a huge literary transition, I was not familiar with that. So for me, this book was actually really very interesting to read for that purpose, and I think that this book would be especially of interest to anyone who might want to understand that bridge between those two literary movements a little bit more. I think that it really fits well into that place right there. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a high 4.5 stars. There are some parts of it that are a little bit slow, but altogether it was really surprising. I am considering doing a more in-depth review, so if that would be of interest to you, then please stick around for that. Next, I read Voyage in the Dark by Rhys, and this is a modern classic. It was written in 1934 and takes place in 1913. We follow Anna Morgan, who was raised in the British Caribbean colonies, and she is now about 20 years old, living in London. Both of her parents have died, so she's sort of on her own now, kind of. She has worked as a showgirl. She's sort of in an affair with an older man, and it's kind of a sugar daddy, sugar baby situation. She is not very good at taking care of herself. Most things happen to her. She's a very passive character. The friend group that she's in, who are not all really great people, very much make the choices for how she's spending her time and where she's living and things like that. And she's clearly a little bit of a depressed character. She doesn't seem to be very good at taking care of herself or coping with the world that she lives in. I felt that the author was making some really interesting criticism about the kinds of roles available to women during the 1910s. Anna becomes the sugar baby that she is, in part because there's not other options available to her. You know, she's not, I guess, of good enough birth to make like a really good connection. But when women in the story choose to financially support themselves and to sort of be independent in a way that is choosing a route that is not prioritizing marriage, those women have a social sphere and a economic cap to their potential that they can't unlock as a single woman. They need to attach themselves to a man in order to do that. And so I guess the harsh reality that Anna faces is that she is in a situation where she, for her physical and economic security, has to exchange sexual favors to this man. And this is not really a sustainable format of support for Anna. She is appealing to a lot of the men in the story because she was raised in the Caribbean and they find that really exotic. She's a white character, but they find her being foreign really exotic. So there's a really interesting interaction between Anna as a colonial-born British person coming back to sort of the center of the colonial empire, and she does not portray London in a favorable light. It is dark, and she really doesn't like it. She wishes she could go back to the Caribbean, and it's really exposing a lot of the hypocrisy and the moral degeneracy of the London British society at this time, in contrast to what she feels was, better was her Caribbean childhood. So that's a very interesting sort of post-colonial conversation surrounding these locations and the sort of, I guess, cultural atmosphere of that time period. The writing is really easy and comfortable to read, and I found Anna Morgan a very interesting character, so I gave this book 4 stars. The next book I have to talk about is A House for Mr Biswas by V.S. Naipaul, and this book was written in 1961, and it takes place from about the turn of the century through to the 1950s or so. This book takes place in Trinidad and follows Mohan Biswas, who was born unlucky. He had extra fingers, and a pundit present at his birth told that him and his parents that he would have poor fortune, and he unintentionally causes the death of his father, and he sort of accidentally ends up in this marriage he didn't really want, and he spends his entire life wanting to, or trying to, carve out a place for himself in the world, trying to get his own home, and he works very hard, every kind of job that he can get, in order to provide this kind of financial security for himself. But the harder he works, the more he seems to end up in more debt, and the perimeter of the people who he is financially responsible for seems to expand along with however much money he can make. And I don't know exactly what I felt about this book. This was a book assigned for my class, and I wouldn't say I really enjoyed the reading experience. I found it more interesting once we sort of brought it into discussion with other authors such as Dickens, and this book actually does feel very Dickensian in its inspiration. It is, of course, set in Trinidad, which is in the Caribbean, but it is totally a tome. It's like 600 pages. It is very character driven, it has strong economic overtones, and is sort of this long life story, also sort of like David Copperfield, for example. And I did feel that that parallel was appropriate because I thought the author was making some social commentary on how easily the lower income classes are exploited, how systemically difficult it is for impoverished people to break out of the cycle of poverty. However, that idea is not reflected in some of the things that the author himself has said. For example, quote, "The world is what it is. Men who are nothing, who allow themselves to become nothing, have no place in it." Also, quote, "Most people are not really free. They are confined by the niche in the world that they carve out for themselves. They limit themselves to fewer possibilities by the narrowness of their vision." Which I believe is all to say that if you are poor, it is your own fault because you didn't work hard enough or because you didn't dream big enough, and all of that is reductive. I don't agree with that entirely. So I don't know if I missed the point of the novel or if the author is contradicting himself on some level. I'm not sure, but this book just, it didn't really work for me. I didn't entirely enjoy it. I think that it is an accomplished work in some ways, but it didn't suit me, and I only gave it 1 star. Anyway. And the last book that I have to mention here, I've already talked about twice on this channel, but I finished another reread of A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor by Hank Green, which you guys have all heard so much, but I had a really deep analysis reading of this book, and I'm not going to review it again. I'll link the 2 times that I've already talked about it. I don't know if it's on this side or this side. Anyway, I'll link it in the cards if you want to see a more full review. Personally, what really stood out to me this time reading it was a parallel between, there's a theme in the book of, there's a plot point in the book involving virtual reality, but I picked up this time a really strong theme towards subjective personal reality. And what this means is that there is a theme in the book that the way that we view the world and indeed view our own identity is incredibly subjective towards the information we choose to accept and choose to filter into our concept of self and our concept of our worldview. And in this way we can choose to believe in something that is not a true representation of or a factual representation of objective reality, or a subconscious protection of a worldview or self-perception, which means that we dismiss conflicting data out of hand without consideration. So that's just the thought that I had most recently on this book. Like I said, I've already reviewed it, so check those out if you want to hear more about this book that I clearly think is really great. So anyway, that's all that I have for this video, and thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys in another video. Bye!